Okay. So these are our objectives for today. We're going to be discussing fine motor development more generally and what that looks like. We're going to identify ways to promote fine motor development in your classrooms and through various strategies and practical tips that you can use. And then this will also serve as a resource for parents and teachers, but there's also going to be resources embedded throughout this presentation that you can access at a later date. This is the structure of what this information session is going to look like. So we're going to go through fine motor development and just kind of look at what is expected at this age. We're going to go through the fundamentals of fine motor development, so what we need before we even get started. And we're also going to dive more into those fine motor skills, which will lead nicely into some practical tips and classroom ideas. And then we'll wrap it up with a summary, and we'll have time for questions at the end.
So the first thing that we wanted to explain, it's a really good point to start at what our occupational therapist's role within children in the school setting. I'm sure many of you have come across our profession in your roles in the education system. So we thought it would be helpful to understand why our OT is connected with children in school. And the really easy answer is because children's school or children at school, that is their main occupation, which is why OTs have such a pertinent role in school-age children and preschool-age children. So where specifically do we help these children with their skills? Well, we look at children's ability to perform fine motor tasks, which is so much of their kindergarten development. We look at their sensory processing, their emotional regulation, and we help provide strategies to promote independence at school, and we also modify or adapt their learning environment. So we're helping with the development of skill, helping with strategies, and then adaptations if all else fails. It's pretty much what the OT role in a nutshell is in the school environment. So I guess the next point of discussion is, what is a child occupation? So let's break that down a little bit more in detail. So as you may have noticed in working with occupational therapists, we have our hands, pardon the pun, in many different areas of a child's occupations at school, which are including toileting skills, dressing skills, eating, sleeping. That one is not at school, but sometimes it happens at school. Play, as you can see on this slide, is a huge circle because that is really the nucleus of their time in kindergarten. Learning, of course, and then self-regulation sort of weaves itself through all of these different areas, which is why you'll be seeing OTs so heavily involved in sensory or self-regulation, because the self-regulation is critical. So a child's ability to be alert and at their optimal ability to learn and play and toilet and dress and eat and sleep, all of that needs to have sensory processing in place, or else it falls apart, as we all know. So really, that is why you see OTs wearing so many different hats when it comes to pediatrics, just as a good back explanation as to why we cover so many different areas.
So if you look into what is fine motor development, when we talk about fine motor skills, we're referring to a child's ability to use the tiny muscles in their hands, fingers, and wrists to make small, precise, and refined movements. And this can be used for tasks such as picking up coins, holding a pencil between our fingertips, writing, doing up zippers or buttons, opening containers, all of those things. And these skills typically develop in early childhood and set the foundation for more than just child's writing. It sets the foundation for their learning learning, their exploration, and overall physical and academic development. Because of this, poor fine motor skills can actually impact other areas of learning. For example, if a child is able to use their hands freely and easily, it's much easier for them to concentrate on the tasks that they're learning. So a lot of times when we see kids who have fine motor difficulties that haven't resolved, it tends to spill over into other areas of learning. Okay, so this slide is more for reference for you guys to go back to. These are kind of the skills that kids should come into kindergarten with. So we wanted to highlight a few. The first is writing grasp, so it's emerging here. And kids are typically coming in with, they're holding their pencil at their fingertips. So we want to see that. Hand preference is being established. They may still switch for certain tasks, or something's closer to their non-dominant hand, they might still grab it, but it's fairly well established. If you give them a pencil, they'll typically pick it up with the same hand every time. Their pre-printing skills are developing, so perhaps they can, imitate a vertical line, a horizontal line. They're starting to do circles, so it's coming along. They can recognize their name or the letters of their name. And in terms of functional self-care, they're more independent with dressing and toileting, but they still rely on parent or teacher support. And we just wanted to highlight a couple of other things as well. So this idea between whether there's a delay or a lack of exposure or opportunity. So it's really important to understand the difference between whether being able to meet these developmental milestones is due to a lack of exposure versus an actual fine motor delay, where there's muscle weakness. We particularly see this with scissor skills. So before coming into school, a lot of parents just don't expose their kids very much to scissors. And so a lot of times their development with scissor skills seems to look like it's a bit of delay, but it might just be the case that they just haven't held scissors at home or gotten that much practice. And then the other piece is we also wanted you guys to understand that bilateral hand coordination really underpins a lot of these different skills. And so this is where the two hands are really working together to complete a task. So again, with scissor skills, you need to be able to hold the paper with one hand and cut with the other hand. And same with using zippers or even like eating with a fork or a spoon. Again, bilateral coordination is really important here. And we'll talk more about this in a few slides later. And then this will be for, what are our children learning in first and second year kindergarten? So if we look at their handwriting grasp, again, it's a little bit better developed, more consistent. There's a little bit more dynamic movements, which basically just means the movement is coming from their fingertips rather than their whole arm or their shoulder. Pre-printing skills, so they got diagonals down a little bit better. They're really ready to start printing. They're able, again, to recognize their name and letters of their name. This is often the first thing that they learn how to write. And functional self-care, so again, they are becoming more independent with things such as dressing and using the toilet. These are skills that really develop over this time. And that just goes to say that this time is really important for these kids. This is a point in their lives where children's brains are actually able to more easily change and adapt and make those connections. So this is a really important time in their development to really work on these skills. So this is why you'll notice throughout this presentation, we'll stress taking more of a remedial approach, an approach that works on developing those skills, developing those muscles, rather than ideas to compensate for it, because we really want to work on developing that skill and taking advantage of the child's ability to learn during this age.
So when we break down fine motor and how we can be successful with it, LaRue does a really good job of sort of breaking apart the four foundational or fundamental components of fine motor success. So our next 4 slides are going to break these 4 areas down, and we're also going to be giving you helpful tips and activities that you can do to develop these fundamental skills better. So the first one is postural stability. So the way fine motor control or skills develop is really from proximal to distal. That's kind of our general guiding principle. What does that mean? Proximal is close to your body, so we're looking at the shoulder girdle and the pelvis as sort of like our foundation to help support what happens distally, which is like all the way to the ends of our body, aka the fingertips, hands, wrists, etc. So if we don't have stability and core strength in the middle, then we're certainly not going to have great success and be set up for our optimal abilities with the distal part of our bodies, which is our hands and fingers. So looking at things like even just setting them up at the right height at the table, and I know everybody is sort of limited within the tools or equipment that they have in the kindergarten classroom. But in particular, if you know that there's a child who struggles with core or postural stability, then those children are the ones to focus on the most and making sure that their feet are flat on the floor. And if you can't do that with the equipment limitations, looking at something like step stools, or even speaking with your CERTs about getting box chairs or PAL chairs, with the support of an occupational therapist, to help get the child in a piece of equipment that they will be well positioned. We want to look at about an inch of space between elbows and the table. That's how you know they're not hiked up and sort of too high of a table or even too low of a table. And so areas that you can work on developing postural stability or those core strengthening skills, we're looking at whole body activities, animal walks, bear walks, crab walking, wheelbarrow walks, where you hold the child's legs and they walk on their hands. Pouring activities are a great one that happens often in kindergarten at the sensory tables. Easel painting, I know that's a huge one in kindergarten. Window writing, that's a fun one where you get window writers. Crayola makes them, they're great, and you can write on clear glass or windows. I've even seen recently on Instagram or Facebook where you can turn a table upside down with the legs facing up. You can wrap saran wrap around the table legs and have the child write with markers, and it's see-through like a window would be, and you can have children working around the table at that activity. Anything that's really working up on a vertical axis is going to work against gravity and strengthen their shoulders, their arms, and then their wrists. And then prone drawing is laying on your belly and having the child draw or do any sort of coloring or drawing tasks while laying on their belly. And then air drawing or flashlight drawing is something that you could do as a class where they're working again against gravity in the air. It's always going to strengthen that core.
So next we're going to talk about tactile perception and proprioception as a foundation for fine motor. So kind of breaking it down. So tactile perception and proprioception refers to our ability to perceive objects or judge sensations through touch and understanding where our body is in space respectively. So when we talk about tactile perception, this allows us to take in information through touch and tactile stimulation. And then your brain uses this information to help produce accurate and precise movements. So a lot of times when we see this is underdeveloped, it's hard to be accurate with our hands and judging where they are in space or using the appropriate pencil pressure. So just imagine how it would feel doing activities with rubber gloves on. So when tactile perception is impaired, that's kind of what it feels like. So for these activities, you could look into lots of touch and feel games, be creative with COVID, make each student their own bag and do like a blind challenge. So, feeling out different shapes and different textures or sorting different things using our hands and just but lots of sensory exploration. So kinetic stand, water play, shaving cream, sensory bins, all those kinds of things really helps us work on the tactile perception, especially with regard to our hands. In terms of proprioception, this is a little bit more generalized, meaning that it's about those proprioceptors located within the muscles and tendons and joints that are in our fingers, which again allow us to gauge how much pressure to apply, where we are in space. So these two concepts are kind of intertwined. So some activities to kind of bring into the classroom would include, if you notice a student is using heavy pencil pressure, really pressing hard on that crayon, or too light or too rough with toys, add an eraser to the end of the pencil to weigh it down, or you could add like bolts with an eraser and a band around it. You could also play with lots of putty and Play-Doh and other kind of resistance exercises, and consider using things like mechanical pencils to really lighten that pressure, a slant board, or simply a thick binder that's empty and have them write on it, which really enforces them to go into wrist extension, which naturally places their fingers in a better position and would reduce that pressure. Or plastic weave sheets also work for that as well. So just some sort of texture, like sandpaper under their actual paper, will help them kind of realize how hard they're pushing on that pencil and kind of get a more appropriate pencil pressure.
So the next fundamental skill for fine motor is hand function. So this one is kind of obvious in terms of like we need to develop hand strength and hand coordination skills in order to be better at fine motor tasks. So the way we break down hand function is that we have something what's called hand dissociation. So we look at the hand with sort of two sides. The one side where the thumb is, all the way through, including in the middle finger, is what we call the skills side or the working side of the hand. And that's really the side of the hand that, in kindergarten, we really want to develop that working side of the hand. So what does that leave us with? The ring finger and pinky and little finger or pinky finger? Those guys are your stabilizing side of the hand, or the, helper side of the hand. So what they're going to do is really work on stabilizing everything so that the working side of your hand can work better. Finger isolation needs to be developed, obviously, in order to get better with finger grasping skills, play skills, and such. So, as well as finger translation, which is when we take an object and we can transfer it into the palm of our hand, take an object from the palm of our hand and transfer it out to our fingertips. So these are sort of all the basics of hand function. So what are activities that you can do to develop hand function skills in children who may be underdeveloped in those areas? So we call these pinch activities. So I'm sure you've all seen the very trendy Pop-It toys. Those are going to work on various finger isolations, a little bit of hand strength depending on the resistance of that Pop-It toy. Those are helpful. So rolling small balls of Play-Doh and building a snowman. Same thing with putty. If you could get TheraPutty on hand, that's resistance putty. So it strengthens the hands a little bit more when you're working for it. We love the activity of hiding beads or pegs or little plastic items, little letter beads, so they can work on letter recall inside Play-Doh or putty, so that they have to dig for it, pull it apart. They're really developing those pinch side of the hand. Coin activity, so obviously like anything with piggy banks and coins, Connect Four, those are all going to develop that working side of the hand. And then one strategy that we like to remind educators of to help sort of get the children away from including all of those fingers and just focus on the working side of the hand is giving the child cotton balls, pom-poms, even scrunched up tissue paper or it's scrunched up tissue inside of their hand, holding that down with the pinky and ring finger so that the working side of the hand can do its thing. That's a little helpful tip. And then obviously cutting with scissors is also something that will develop the working side of the hand. And I just want to highlight that many of these activities that we'll talk about, you can highlight or flag sort of the children as your kids who need to work on the hand skills, or your kids that need to work on their grasp, and develop a play center around it so that you're targeting these skills sort of as a small group. I don't see myself anymore. There I am. So as a small group, and then you can set up that table with all of these activities there and have 4 to 5 kids working on this at the same time.
Okay, and last of kind of the fundamentals here is bilateral hand coordination, which we talked about previously when we were talking about those developmental milestones. And so again, this really underpins many activities. So many fine motor tasks are very difficult to do if both your hands can't actually work together. Fine motor activities such as eating with a knife and fork, holding a piece of paper while cutting it, tying your shoes, threading beads, these all require your hands to work together in a coordinated way. And often what we see with kids who have poor bilateral coordination skills is that they end up actually avoiding these tasks. And so we really want to encourage practicing that and really, again, trying to get them to use both their hands in a coordinated kind of way. Now, one distinction that we really wanted to make was the simple versus complex bilateral tasks. So it's important to know that there is a difference here. These simple tasks are more ones that require one hand to hold something, so they're more stationary, while the other one is the working hand and completes the complex aspect of the task. So an example of this would be, like cutting a piece of paper, or even if you're writing, you're using your stabilizing hand, and then you're using your other hand to actually complete the written work. And then on the opposite end, there are activities where both hands are doing different things, and these are typically a bit harder for students to learn, and should be considered when helping your students out. So you might want to start, if you notice the child has poor bilateral hand coordination, you're not going to start with super complicated tasks, but complex ones, like tying your shoes where both of your hands need to be doing different things. You might start with the easier ones, cutting a piece of paper, or just using one hand to stabilize your paper first. So really thinking about gradually increasing the difficulty of the task as the child develops those skills. And so here, in terms of activities, we've kind of looked at how we can break down those tasks and progress them from easier to a little bit more difficult. And this is, in OT, we really refer to this as grading the task. So in terms of cutting, you can start by snipping straws, doing one snip into paint strips, using thicker paper, then 2 snips with thinner paper. In terms of beading, you can start by beading using a wooden dowel, so it's not like flimsy. Then you can use a pipe cleaner and then progress to more string, where it involves a little bit more of that complex coordination. And then other bilateral activities are the Velcro food that you can use, cutting Play-Doh with utensils, doing up buttons, using a ruler to draw a line. Those are all bilateral coordination activities that are great practice for kids. Okay, so in this slide here, we've kind of just highlighted all the different materials and things that we went over in this session. So at the very top in the middle, you can see 2 kids working on their drawing skills, but also they're working on the upper extremity stabilization piece, right? They're really using their muscles to prop themselves up. Right in the middle circle, this is the cotton ball idea for practicing using that hand association, the working side of our hand versus the stabilization side. If you look in the bottom right corner, this kiddo is using some writing on the window, and you can see that his wrist is nicely in extension, and those fingers have a nice open web space. We always talk about the OK fingers. And then if you look above him, You can see this is a sensory bin. So this is just one idea. There's many different ones that you could do, but this one just looks like it has some beans in it, and some other kind of activities for them. And then if you look in the top left corner, there's the Velcro food, there's the poppets. And then in terms of weighing down the pencil, if you notice heavy pressure, these kind of bigger erasers really help with that and can be found really at Dollarama. And then at the bottom is a slant board, but like I said, you could again just use a thick binder that's empty and have the child write on the binder so that their wrist is forced into extension again. Okay, so leading into kind of the second half of this presentation, these are more the fine motor skills that you'll see in your classroom that are kind of the focus of this age. So we're going to look at pre-printing, pencil grasp, targeted coloring and the importance of that, scissor skills, and then self-help skills. So again, doing up those buttons and zippers and that kind of thing.
So the first one is pre-printing skills or printing readiness skills. If you look at the little VMI model, this assessment, the visual motor integration assessment, is one that OTs often will do. And so these numbers underneath each shape or form is kind of the age norms that this test expects children to be able to have that skill developed. So if you bring your attention to the plus, at 4 years old, so most children entering first year kindergarten would be 4 or turning 4 within the next few months. That is sort of that age when the intersecting lines develop. So if they don't have the ability to make a cross yet, then certainly expectations for certain letters where they are intersecting lines like F or T would be more challenging for them if they haven't quite developmentally learned that skill. And then diagonals is another big one that we forget that, a lot of letters, A is a big one. It comes up often early on in school writing that it has diagonals in it. And so depending on where the where the child is at developmentally in their pre-writing skills, they may or may not be able to produce the letter A if they can't quite do a diagonal line. So working on developing the pre-printing skills first in isolation will really help the child be able to master and be successful with writing letters, because these are your foundational skills for letters.
Yeah, and one other point that I just wanted to highlight here, if you turn your attention to the picture at the bottom of the screen, getting the child to even draw, a pretty picture or a flower can include all of these shapes without, just having them draw a cross or a square. So you notice like the wheels of the car, that would mimic the circle. Then there's some nice diagonal and intersecting lines for the spokes of the car, some squares. So really trying to make this fun for them and just turning this in a way that can be really play-based is important here. So on this slide, I want to talk about learning letters and the multisensory approach. And this is a really hot topic. And I wanted to say a word about the handwriting without tears, or they call it learning without tears now, is that we're not going to dive too deep into that today. But many of the principles that are underlying handwriting without tears have been and will continue to be discussed throughout this presentation. And so it really underpins the Handwriting Without Tears program, and we really like the principles that are used here, but we don't necessarily just solely use handwriting without tears. The other piece is we want to consider using consistent language when we're teaching letters. So the Handwriting Without Tears curriculum uses, big line, big curve, little curve. So really being consistent with that so that kids can easily associate these words with the correct letter formation patterns. But another piece to consider is that handwriting without tears isn't necessarily the end-all be-all. Sometimes this doesn't work. So I personally know one of our clients that we've been doing handwriting without tears for a couple of years, and it's just not sticking. So using something else, another great program to consider is ABC Boom. This is a program that is used mainly as their primary printing program in the province of Quebec. And so I've connected links here if you're interested in those. There's a worksheet connected to it that kind of helps you learn the ropes of that. So it might be worth trialing something like that if that's appropriate. Okay, so when we talk about multisensory approach to learning, this really attempts to present information to children in a way that involves multiple systems. So the visual, auditory, tactile, and kinesthetic systems are the primary sources that students use, and these really correspond to the visual, auditory, vestibular, and motor memory systems. So there's actually research to suggest that this approach to learning is so effective because of three things. So primarily, these strategies really stimulate the brain in a number of ways so that it involves each sensory system in their learning and helps to encode that information, but it also engages multiple areas of the brain, which makes that cognitive demand higher, which makes focusing on what you're teaching easier. And then lastly, multisensory learning ensures that each child, regardless of what learning type they are, whether they're a visual learner, it provides every learner with a means of understanding the information that's presented in the classroom. So this is really kind of the gold standard that we see in our practice.
So just to play off of what my colleague Monica just laid out the foundation and paved the road for why we are so big on sensory as occupational therapists. The next slide will give you a whole list of activities, which I'm sure many of you have used before, but just to go through them real quick. So sensory, and paper and pencil or marker and paper are last. So we are going to encode those letter formations and teach printing to students with their whole body, with visual stimulation, with tactile stimulation. We are going to teach that first and many, many times, and then getting the paper to pencil, the pencil to paper last, once it is ingrained from all the sensory first. So some quick examples: window writing, as I discussed earlier, flashlight writing, getting little dollar store flashlights, turning off the lights, and we're going to draw our big line down, jump, slide, and up for the letter N, capital N. So that's a super fun one, tracing letters on each other's backs. Even with COVID, we can be creative and, get back to our normal, like allowing children to be touching each other and a little bit hands-on with some hand sanitizer. We can get back to these kinds of methodologies. Full body air writing is similar to the flashlight writing. Flashlights on the wall you can do so they can actually get some visual feedback when they're doing the writing in the air. Tracing lines, curves, and shapes. So tracing is always fun. The handwriting without tears or learning without tears, wood pieces, but you can really use other sort of building activities or building toys to get them to use pieces and build out of them. Magnadoodles are fun, as you can see in the picture. Smartboard writing, I know most kindergarten classrooms now have smartboards, so that would be a nice sensory way to practice writing, and again, big movements. Sand writing, so giving each child their own little baking tray with colored sand, and they can practice writing letters in that. Paint bags, as you can see in the picture, you put paint into a nice, good, firm Ziploc bag, and the child can either use a writing tool or their finger to draw the letters, roll a dough, so you're rolling Play-Doh and forming it into letters, and Wiki sticks is another one, those wax sticks that you can form into letters. The list goes on and on and on. So the next area is pencil grasp. So this is obviously a very hot topic. I'm going to go through it real fast. As you can see in the picture or the little diagram on top, those three grasps are what we would call an inefficient or incorrect pencil grasp. So the one on the top left would be what we call a pronated grasp. That's what you really would see developmentally appropriate in a 2-year-old. So the child has the pencil secured in their palm, and their index finger is really leading the movement. But you can see with that kind of grasp, it's really whole arm movements. You're not going to get any sort of wrist or finger movements with that inefficient grasp. The other two grasps are what we would call fisted grasps. And again, they're inefficient because you don't get finger movements, so you won't get accuracy, and they're going to cramp up their hand real fast if they're in that type of grasp. Functional pencil grasps that we would say are appropriate are below. So the dynamic tripod grasp, that's what most people are familiar with, where your thumb and index are securing the pencil against your middle finger. There's also a modified tripod grasp, as you can see in the middle picture. It's also considered appropriate. And then the quadrupod grasp is when there's like an extra finger on the pencil. Did I miss anything? So activities to promote a functional grasp. Again, think of that concept of having a little pencil grasp group. They're your activity station where you get your kiddos who are struggling with good grasps, and you can get them at the table and working on developing these skills. How do we do that? So we can have broken down crayons, golf pencils, little broken down chalks, flip crayons, or the handwriting without tears, two-sided crayons, so that when they switch crayons each time, they're not having to re-grasp. They can just flip it in their appropriate grasp. There's something called effortless art crayons. You can find those on Amazon. They're nice little triangular shaped crayons that have a little bit of a blocker on them, and they force the fingers into a better grasp. Working on pinch activities that we talked about earlier. And pencil holders are also helpful to have, just Staples pencil holder, and you can put the writing tool in that so that the child just has to pinch and pick up. They don't have to get it off the table and then reposition it in their hand. So again, we had talked about the pom-poms or tissue in the stabilizing side of the hand. We talked about developing hand strength through putty, Play-Doh. You can also work on tweezers and tong activities, picking up objects and placing them into different bins, clothespins, single hole punchers. That will develop the grasping skills with hand strength development. And then again, looking at the wrist position, window writing, slant board, writing on an easel or the wall or a smart board is going to help with that. And then like Monica spoke about earlier with heavy pencil pressure, the different strategies that you can do to overcome that. So we're going to talk very quickly about why is coloring important. So coloring is sort of your backbone or your precursor with those pre-printing skills to developing a child's ability to be successful long-term in school fine motor writing and fine motor skills. So what does coloring, or targeted coloring, so coloring in the lines, what does it develop? It develops pencil control, because you're working on the finer movements with the writing, crayon, marker, pencil inside the lines. That's working on your control of the pencil to then help with printing on the lines down the road. Visual motor integration, so that eye-hand coordination is developing when a child is coloring in the lines. It helps them with pencil pressure. You'll notice that students work on coloring really, really hard to fill in all that white space, or they're coloring a little bit lighter to get those finer area, those smaller areas colored in. So it helps develop those like those little nuances with what is correct or incorrect pencil pressure. And of course, it helps with grasp. It's just solidifying grasp over and over again when a child is coloring. And the list goes on when we talk about targeted coloring, why it's important to develop in kindergarten. So if you look at the next slide, we really want to give you strategies on how we can help children with targeted coloring, because not everyone is good at it. Not everyone's good at coloring in the lines.
Yeah, so some strategies and activities that we could use are those visual cues. So perhaps outlining where the border is first and then coloring it in is a good strategy. Aim and scribble is a technique from Handwriting Without Tears, and it's depicted here on the right, the big picture there. Giving relatable cues, so, use your wiggle fingers or baby scribbles and then big scribbles. Wiki sticks as borders, so again, they get that proprioceptive feedback. Oh, I went too far, okay, and then coloring back in the borders. Similarly, you could do glue borders, so do up a bunch of sheets at the same time, outline them in glue, and then those will be for all your kids that have kind of difficulties with fine motor, the pencil control. Thinking about finger versus wrist versus whole movements. So, instead of doing, if you're coloring a little spot, then you're using more of your finger movements. But if you're going to ask the child to color a huge area, then they might use more of their whole arm. And again, really promoting that optimal wrist position so that their fingers can do what they need to do. Because if you look at your wrist and if it's in flexion, your fingers automatically go out and your web space automatically collapses. So when we push our fingers back and our wrist into extension, it automatically creates that O position.
And what we want to really focus on here is quality over quantity. So if the child's expected to color in an entire, theme booklet, a Halloween booklet, or a Christmas booklet, if you know that that's a deficit area for the child, their targeted coloring or their ability to color on the lines, I think we'd all rather them, sort of focus on one object per page to color in really, really well, rather than getting the entire book colored and then it ends up just looking messier like scribbles, and it feels quite daunting for the child. So just remembering that quality over quantity when it comes to those coloring in the line activities.
Yes, thanks, Nicole. And just really thinking about why we're doing those coloring activities and what skills we want to get out of them. So if we take a look at this one, so scissor skills, there's a lot of different things going on here that we've already talked about. So this really requires all those foundational components that we discussed between postural stability, bilateral coordination, hand strength, all of those things. So all the strategies we provided previous to this slide about that would also be applicable here for scissor skills. So just taking that into consideration. But of course you can do a little bit more specific scissor practice. So some strategies and activities are these here. Again, really thinking about starting with simple activities that are easy and achievable and kind of grading or making them difficult as the child's skill develops. So first you might want to start with just snipping. So, using Play-Doh or putty or straws are always fun. Then go to fringing. So use paint chips or paper plates. And then cutting lines of different lengths. We'll start with like straight lines, then cutting corners. So start with one corner, then proceed to cutting triangles, squares. Stars would obviously be a lot more difficult, then to cutting curves. And this will really help all the little components that go into cutting. Where do I position my helper hand? When do I turn it? So other considerations for these activities would include what types of scissors are you going to use? So if a child has weakness in their hand and they have a really hard time opening scissors and closing scissors, you could use spring scissors, or you could use loop scissors or double loop scissors. Think about different paper types. So thick paper, cardstock is typically easier to cut because it's less work for your helper hand to hold. households. Or a great idea is the paint chits that you can get from like home reno stores. So they're just nice little snips, and they're usually thicker. And stickers are a great idea to promote a thumbs up position. So when we're cutting, we want both thumbs up, our helper hand and our cutting hand. So if we put stickers on our hands, we can always refer, oh, we need to see your stickers. And also you can put them on the page to indicate where the child needs to put their helper hand or turn the paper if they're cutting corners.
So this next slide just gives you a nice visual of some of the things that Monica just talked about. So if you look on your far right, those are the different types of scissors. The loop scissors are the ones where simply you just have to squeeze. You don't even have to grasp inside loops, like inside the actual scissor handles. And then the spring-loaded scissors is in the center. What's nice about these is you can take the spring load off or on, so you can use them for both children who need them or don't need them. And then the double loop scissors are for those children who might need a little bit more help feeling the movement. An adult can get in there in the second set of loops and do it with them. So they're still going through the motions and getting that, what we call that motor planning down pat, but they're really not doing the snipping yet. That's on the adult who's helping them. And then you see the picture of cutting straws. Cutting straws gives them a really nice sensory feedback because you feel it and you hear it when that pop happens. Same thing with Play-Doh. You're going to get a really nice proprioceptive feel of the snip, which just helps solidify the skill. And then as you can see on the left, all the different graded activities for snipping and practicing those single snips. So the fringing activities, the different length lines that you can cut for the stems of the flowers, and that's the paint chits on the left with the green. So you can get those at Home Depot, and you can, it's nice because it gives you a very clear line. It's colorful, it's the perfect size, and it's the perfect thickness.
Okay, and the last skill that we're going to talk about is these kind of self-help skills, and we group them together because a lot of these require the same kind of skills to be able to do. So like everything else that we talked about, this includes a lot of the things that the underlying foundational components that all these other tasks also require. Now also just thinking about being able to cross the midline is also important here for buttons and zippers and dressing with our mitts. And just using all the skills that we talked about already. So we can think of strategies in this case to either help the child develop their skill or give them tools to compensate for their challenges. So if you remember what we talked about earlier, really seeing which opportunities are appropriate for a child to either develop their skill, or is this something that we can compensate for? So maybe these kids just haven't had the exposure and they just need a little bit more practice zipping up their coat, but developmentally they're going to catch up by themselves. So for those kids, it would be appropriate to, lend a hand and zip up their coat that one time or a few different times, but they still have the opportunity to learn, and they're essentially going to meet that skill even if you don't necessarily provide them with those skill development chances. But on the other hand, there's children who need that skill development, and we do recognize that there's a lot of time that goes into this and one-on-one work, which isn't always feasible within the classroom. So really looking at how can we build that skill development, but also you might want to use some of these compensatory strategies in conjunction with the skill development. So maybe not necessarily every single time you're working on skill development, but you are working on it frequently enough that the child is getting exposure to really develop that. So some strategies would be to encourage the child to try as much of the task on their own. Walk the child through the task from their perspective. So if they're trying to zip up their coat, you're in behind them, zipping it up with your arms in front of them so that they have their perspective is how they would actually do the task. offer more support at the beginning of the task and then back off support as the child learns the steps. So perhaps the first time we're learning to tie our shoes, we're doing most of the step and we're just getting them to pull the bunny ears at the end. And then as the child learns that step, then the next thing that they would do, you would do a little bit less each time. We call this backwards chaining. Practicing off the body. So if you're practicing zippers, you could use backpacks and lunch boxes. If there's clothing on dolls, same with for buttons. You could use different pieces of clothing, snaps on your hat, shoes on the table, that kind of thing. In terms of zippers, so we want to start with unzipping first. It's easier. And you also always just want to demonstrate the skill first. A lot of kids are visual and really need that visual input and understanding of what's going on. And then in terms of compensation, so if we want to use larger zippers, so for example, if you see ski passes, or you can use simply labels like folded in half onto their zipper so that it makes it easier to grip. You can put paper clips on there, keychains, zipper, extensions / poles. Larger buttons are typically easier, button hooks, a visual schedule. So this is where I really want to acknowledge that there's a lot that goes into dressing. So this includes the cognitive piece, and sometimes it can be very difficult to focus on those motor skills and really working on that motor planning and that motor coordination when we have to understand what are all the steps, what do I do first? So if we take away that cognitive piece and give them a visual schedule to help out with the steps, they can then just focus on the motor development there. And again, breaking it into small steps with simple language, and simply just giving them more time to complete the task more generally.
And this is just a quick visual of what Monica just described. So as you can see, the little key chains or zipper extensions or zipper pulls, that allows the child to get more leverage, to then be more successful pulling up the coat. As well, it will allow them to get a fisted grip on it if they're not quite at that more delicate pinch level of development for their fine motor. And then these different button, tie, zip, snap are dressing practice boards that you could really make yourself or purchase them online, but like Monica said, working on these skills for those who have deficits on the table first, so off the body, is going to make it much easier to learn that skill, and then we help get that skill developed on the body with the support from behind from a teacher or EA or ECE. And then there's an example of a visual schedule. So it's very simple, just helping them with the order of what to put on first, so it takes that cognitive demand out of the task and they can focus on the motor. So just a summary of our presentation today. These children are very perfectly set up with good posture and a little bit of a slant. And I know that's not a perfect, that's not the world we live in, and we have to make do with the resources that we have available to us. But anytime that you're working with the children in the classroom and developing their fine motor skills, think about the why. It helps you, I guess, it justifies for you, the coloring. Why are we doing this? Is it just so that it looks beautiful, or there's so many skills that are being developed in the process of coloring, for example? So really think about the why to help you remind yourself that you're in a really important position in their development to help make these skills solidified for their future of fine motor in school.
And our next takeaway point is really meeting the child where they are at. So one of the key pieces of OT is that we really want the child to be successful and enjoy the task. The last thing we want is for the task to be so difficult that they don't want to do it and they don't engage it, and therefore their skills then further decline. So really meeting them where they are at, and let's help them be successful. So, what we talked about grading. So if they can't cut a piece of paper, let's start with straws. Let's meet them where they at, build on their skills, and then progress to more difficult tasks once that development has kind of started.
The next one is quality over quantity. I touched on it with coloring. scale down the task and just give them one small area to color, or just give them one part of that cutting activity to do, so that you get success, they feel success, and it's not daunting for anyone, and you're getting better quality, developing the skill properly instead of just rushing through the task and it being done by an adult or incorrectly by the child.
And also we wanted to highlight the value of play. So a lot of the different skills and the activities we suggested can really be integrated into their play. And to the points that we just made, it would make it fun for them and really help them to be successful. And this is their main occupation. This is what they want to be doing. So I think the value of play cannot be underestimated here, and really needs to be thought of, okay, how can we incorporate these things into their play so that they are engaged and they are successful and we can make progress.
And then the last big one, because we know how strapped and busy kindergarten teachers and staff are, it doesn't have to be fancy or expensive. It doesn't have to be OT specific therapy tools. These resources that we've shared today are available at dollar stores, at Michael's, at Scholar's Choice, on Amazon, within your own school resource cupboards. So be creative and find the everyday tools to make, and like I said, having little tables or your little groups, your pencil grasp group or your targeted coloring group, and you can set up these stations or a table with the activities as we described to help develop these foundational fine motor skills for their future.